This video is on the respiratory system. The respiratory system is the way that we get oxygen into the body, carbon dioxide and waste gases out of the body. The process really involves the two systems: the circulatory system, which moves those gases around the body and get them to and from the lungs, and then the respiratory system that moves it in and out of the body. There are really four processes involved. Two of them are strictly the respiratory system. The other two are the circulatory system, both of which we're going to cover in the first part of this semester. So the first thing is the active breathing. It's called pulmonary ventilation. It's about moving air into and out of the lungs. It's the mechanics of the movement of the air. Now remember that the inside of the lungs, the lumen of the air passages, are still outside of the body. They're external to the body. Once you get the air to the lungs, in this space, in the alveolar space it's called, we still have to then absorb it into the body, and we have to get the carbon dioxide out of the body and into the air of the lungs, and then we have to ventilate by exhaling. So that we call that process the external respiration. Then we have to move those gases through the body with the circulatory system, which we'll be talking about at great length. But basically, the gases are either dissolved or they're carried on the red blood cells. And then we have to get these gases to exchange at the tissue level, and we call this internal respiration. We'll be talking at length about these things. A good thing to think about when you look at a list like this is to start thinking about pathology. There are going to be various pathologies of the respiratory system that involve any of these steps. And they will all result in basically the same sort of symptomatology, more or less. A lack of oxygen, a buildup of carbon dioxide. So you can have pathologies of ventilation. That would be things like COPD or asthma, or a pillow being pushed down over your face or something. That prevents, broken ribs, prevent the movement of the air into and out of the lungs. Then we can have problems of external respiration. This would be things like fibrosis of the lungs, emphysema, things where the exchange doesn't happen properly. We can have problems of transport of oxygen, things like anemia come to mind. Internal respiration issues can happen as well. All of them result in not enough oxygen to adequately make ATP aerobically. So just good to think about it that way. So when we look at the respiratory system, basically there's a number of organs involved. The first one, the obvious one, is the nose. Now the nose is, as we'll see in a minute, is far more than the proboscis, the bit that sticks out in front of your face. It goes all the way back almost to the spine. The pharynx is below that, and it's a passageway for both air and food in the digestive system. The larynx basically has two functions. One is it routes. It's the switch. It's the routing mechanism for food and air at the epiglottis, and it's also the place where voice production happens. The trachea is a tube that conducts air down to the lungs, and it's a tube just for air. The bronchi and bronchiole and all the branches are the places, the tubes that conduct the air to the zone that respiration will actually happen at. They are still passive conduits of air. And then down in the lungs, in the alveoli, is where the external respiration actually takes place, where the gas exchange happens. This is an overall view of it. All of this takes place above the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is also an organ of the respiratory system. It's skeletal muscle, and it's used for ventilation. When we look at the zones, then, therefore, we're going to look at the areas that are strictly involved with ventilation. These are the pipes. These are the conduits that carry the air from outside to the places where gas exchange can happen. And we call that the conducting zone. The respiratory zone is the part of this system where gas exchange actually happens, where oxygen leaves the outside air and enters into the body, where carbon dioxide leaves the body and mixes with the outside air, ready to exhale. So the respiratory zone really are small, thin structures. So they're the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli themselves, which is where the gas exchange primarily happens. And the conducting zone is virtually everything else. There are also a bunch of muscles that are used to aid in ventilation. I think we call them the respiratory muscles. The diaphragm is the most important one, but the muscles between the ribs, the scalene muscles at the front of the neck, the all kinds of muscles, any muscles that can raise or lower the ribs, or so therefore attached to the ribs somehow, can act as synergists to the respiratory action, cause ventilation. So we'll start out with the nose. The nose really has a number of functions. You don't think of it as so much, but it's an important structure. Not only does it provide the air, the passageway, the way that air does enter into the conducting zone, it also moistens and warms the air. Respiration doesn't happen if it's too dry. The alveoli surfaces have to be wet, and so a lot of the moistening happens at the nose. The nose also is involved with cleaning the air, with filtering it. That's what nose hairs are for. That's what the mucus is for. That's basically what snot's about, is trapping anything that's any particles that are in the air, dust and smoke, etc. Right? As anybody who's ever had a head cold knows, there's a resonating chamber that's part of the nose, and it serves to make speech articulate. If you block your nose and you try and speak, you end up sounding like this, which is just a demonstration of the resonating functions of the nose. And last and not least, it's the organ of smell, of olfaction. And this is where the olfactory organs are found. So what you tend to think of as the nose, the proboscis, is the external nose, the nasal cavities. There's the external nose has a root, a bridge, the dorsum nasi, and an apex. Uh, the two little grooves that go from your nostrils down to your lips, to your upper lip, is called the philtrum. It's actually, the groove is called the philtrum, but there's the two little ridges are the edges of the philtrum, and they form a really important function to a nursing baby. It prevents the curled lip of a suckling baby from actually blocking the nostrils, so the baby can breathe while breastfeeding. The nostrils are called the nares, and on either side of that, there's the ala. There's an ala left and an ala right, so ali together. So the bridge of the nose is here. The dorsum of the nose, dorsum nasi, is here. The ala on either side, that's where you get the piercings. The apex is the tip of the nose, nostrils, and the philtrum. That's the surface anatomy. Deep to that, we see that there's a number of different tissues. There are a number of bones, skull bones involved. The nasal bones form the bridge. The frontal bone forms part of the bridge. The maxilla forms kind of the lateral side of the bridge. You can see where they all come together, and there's little sutures in between them. There's a number of cartilages make up most of the dorsum nasi, and extending down into the ala. And then the ala itself is mostly made up of a dense connective tissue proper, and not, in fact, cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is not as flexible as that dense connective tissue, so it's why the apex of your nose is fairly rigid, and the ala that go over the nostrils is more flexible. Ala, by the way, means wing, so we'll see the word ala a number of times in a number of different systems. Inside the nose, there's the nasal cavity. So it's posterior to the nose. Up the middle, there's a wall that separates it into the left and right. That's the midline septum, the nasal septum. The front part of the nasal septum is cartilage. The posterior part of the nasal septum is made of bone. There are apertures that happen through there. It's called the concave. We looked at it when we looked at the bones of the skull, the turbinate bones in the nasal concave. The roof is made of the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. The ethmoid bone has got the cribriform plate where the olfactory nerve passes through. The floor of the nose is actually the roof of the mouth. It's the palate, the hard palate in the front and the soft palate posterior. The part that your finger goes in when you're picking your nose is called the vestibule. It's the part where the hairs grow, which are called vibrissae, but it's really nose hairs. It's a little tougher and a little coarser than back a little further. Back a little further, there's an epithelial layer called the nasal or the olfactory mucosa. So it's on the roof right at the ethmoid bone, and this is where the this is where the olfactory nerves enter, and so this is where the sense of smell happens. It's right at the very roof of the nose. The rest of the mucosa is called the nasal mucosa. Uh, it's a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Uh, it has goblet cells. It produces mucus, and the mucus is more complex than you would first think. There are important secretions. There's defensins and lysozymes that kill bacteria and viruses. Um, and it's part of a defense mechanism, the first line of defense. Um, it's ciliated, so the cilia, and remember, cilia move things past cells, flagella move cells through the medium. So it's like crowd surfing. So the cilia actually are all sweeping this mucus towards the throat. It's moving posteriorly, so that we end up swallowing it. It's measured in liters per day, how much we actually swallow. And when you think about it, mucus is mostly protein and water. We can't afford, if we make 2 liters of mucus a day, we can't afford to lose that much protein or water. We have to recycle it. It's very highly vascularized, as anybody who's ever had a nosebleed can attest to. And this vascularization really aids in moistening and warming the air. There's all kinds of sensory nerve endings in there too that trigger sneezing if there are large particles enter, and it just helps you from breathing them into deeper into the respiratory system. In cross section, it looks like this. So this is a sagittal section. You can see that the 3 conchae, the superior, middle, and inferior conchae, end up creating some passages which are termed meatus. And so the meatae are the meatuses are the passageways that air have to pass through. And as the air passes through these kind of spiral-shaped spaces, it acts like a Dyson vacuum cleaner, swirls the air and by centrifugal force throws dust into the mucus, and it helps protect, it helps clean the air. We call the opening into the nasopharynx the posterior nasal aperture. And you can see that the posterior nasal aperture right here is virtually right next to the spine. This is C2. That's the anterior arch of C1 right there. This is the occipital bone here, extending down. So all of this right from here to here is considered the nose. It opens into this area here called the nasopharynx. Now the nasopharynx is still a passageway for air only. Very seldom does food get up in there. The uvula, which is this part of the soft palate hanging down, when you swallow, closes that off. And unless you happen to be laughing while you're drinking milk, it prevents things that you're swallowing from going up into your nose. In the nasopharynx, there's an opening to the eustachian tube. It used to be called the eustachian tube, a tube that equalizes the pressure behind the ear, behind the eardrum. We now call it the pharyngeotympanic tube. Eardrum is the tympanic membrane, so it goes from the pharynx to the tympanic. I still like the term eustachian tube. It's what I grew up with. Right here is a tonsil called the the pharyngeal tonsil. When that gets inflamed, it's called an adenoid. A lot of people get it removed because of snoring. Inferior to that is the oropharynx. The oropharynx is a passageway for both food being swallowed and air being breathed. Because it has to deal with the friction and of food, it can't be the same same epithelium as the nasal mucosa, the respiratory mucosa. So right about here, there's a transition of epithelium from a pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium to a stratified squamous epithelium, a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So it's multi-layers, stratified squamous, and is not hard like skin. There's no keratin in it, but nevertheless, it's the same sort of idea. This is where the other tonsils are. The palatine tonsil hangs on the palate. The lingual tonsil is on the tongue. On the sides are the pharyngeal tonsils. And this area, when we see the digestive system, we'll talk about it. It's called the fauces. It's the back of the mouth. The air continues down into this area here, which is called the laryngopharynx. It's the pharynx that leads to the larynx. Right? And you can see that right here, the larynx is the passageway, the switch almost, for the air going down the trachea or food going down the esophagus. Here, when we're breathing, this lid, the epiglottis, is open and air passes down this way. When we're swallowing, you push your tongue up, which pulls this end up, which drops that like a garbage can lid, closes off the trachea here, and food goes down the esophagus. I talked about this already, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. We saw them when we were looking at the bones of the skull. So it's about filtering, heating, moistening air. Something that we forget is that as we're breathing out, we would be losing lots of heat and moisture. This is actually reclaimed somewhat in the nose. There are sinuses involved, and they're named for the bones that these spaces are in. So the sinuses in the frontal bone are called the frontal sinuses. There's sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary sinuses. It's about lightening the skull, warming and moistening the air, and it's about creating the resonance chambers for voice production. The pharynx is the passageway for both air and food, which I've already just talked about. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium in the nasopharynx. There's the adenoids and the eustachian tube, the auditory tube. Oropharynx, stratified squamous. There are a number of tonsils there as well. Laryngopharynx, passageway for food and air. It's posterior to the epiglottis when the epiglottis is open. It's continuous with the esophagus. Same picture that we've just looked at.